Hello and welcome to this Energion Politics moment. I'm going to be talking with Dr. Allan Bevere. Today we'll focus a lot on U.S. politics briefly with all the presidential election stuff, and I hope some things that are perhaps maybe less, how shall I say, getting less attention, but may actually be more important. But first, with the major terrorist attack in France, the last I was hearing was, I think, 84 people killed, over 200 people injured. And one of the things you and I were talking about just before we went on air here was extremism. And this is one of those things that, that I think people watch. After a certain number of times, you see an act of terrorism like this committed by somebody with, shall we say, an Arabic name, and people start to see everybody in Islam, everybody in the Arab world in one way. And is that not just possibly a natural reaction for people?
Well, I think it can be a natural reaction, certainly from what scares us. There are things that scare us, but the one thing that we mustn't do is well, it's also easier to interpret reality simply or simplistically. But we also have to be careful about the broad brush conclusions. I just, this morning, in light of that attack, I think I read somewhere in just perusing the news headlines that Newt Gingrich has now said that we should have a Sharia law test for Muslims to see if they embrace Sharia law. And of course, Sharia law in Islam and how it's understood is just as diverse in Islam as how to understand Torah in Judaism and Christianity. When I was in seminary back in the 80s, there was a movement called the Christian Reconstruction Movement, which wanted to apply the law of Moses and all of its commandments to the state. Wanted to use the law of Moses, and there were certainly a lot of people who very much also believed in the law of Moses who said that that was a misapplication. So here is where we need to be careful about making these kinds of judgments about Islam and about extremism, and that certainly the way that ISIS understands Sharia law is very different from the way the vast majority of the world's Muslims understand it.
Which doesn't mean, of course, that we cannot protect ourselves from those who actually are extremists. I think this is and I'm guessing that you would reject that dichotomy as well. There's sort of either you don't distinguish between one Muslim and another, one branch of Islam and another, or you aren't interested in protecting against terrorism that comes from some branch of Islam.
That's right. That's right. And again, this is how we always set up, because we're polarized, we're not listening to one another. We set up these extreme dichotomies. So if you're someone like me, who, by the way, thinks that the United States ought to have a fairly generous policy toward refugees, that doesn't mean I reject the idea of a vetting process. That doesn't mean that I think we should just be willy-nilly about it. And so it is certainly possible. I mean, as we say, it's possible to walk and chew gum at the same time. It's possible to hold these ideas together in a more nuanced way. It doesn't have to be either or.
It's an interesting one, and I know we were doing it, maybe going a bit far afield, but I'm sure you'd be willing to comment. And I think it was Comedy Central's Trevor Noah saying that it's possible to believe that Black Lives Matter and Cops Lives Matter at one and the same time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, And as one, by the way, who served in an urban setting as a pastor for 5 years and dealing with minorities in certain capacities in law enforcement and the justice system, I can tell you, at least from my experience, that there are serious and concerning subtleties in the way African Americans are treated. I've had lawyers tell me that, white lawyers tell me that when they have a client who's African American, in many ways they have to take a different approach to their defense. So that is there. That is not saying, of course, that the police departments all around the country are all a bunch of corrupt racists. And that law enforcement carries a critical and important role, and they deserve our support and our respect. And yes, I think too, they also deserve some deference as well. But we cannot also ignore the fact that there are at times certain things that happen in law enforcement that are not equitable and fair to minorities.
And when we come into a response to these situations, I'd have to say at the same time that there are things that happen that are not equitable and fair to the police officers.
That's right.
We need perhaps to recognize that the police.
Well, that's right. When I was a police chaplain in a small town for a couple of years, and it was just a small town, so it's not like we had a whole lot of crime or anything. But I can tell you there were 2 or 3 citizens of that town who were just looking for any of the police officers in that small department to mess up. They were just looking for a problem. And, you know, that is certainly the kind of suspicion that those officers certainly didn't deserve.
So I wanted to look at both of those because of the notions of extremism, and then also to give you a chance to comment on the election. I guess I'm assuming that you're probably not going to want to come out and endorse a candidate or something, but since I know that neither you nor I are particularly into the parties as such, that sometimes gives a slightly different view of the candidates. I know that much of the time I feel a little bit odd reading the advocacy, because it seems like a lot of what's being said is so-and-so is so bad that you ought to vote for my candidate. And that is the primary form of persuasion, much less my candidate is so good you should vote for him or her. So how does it feel from your neck of the woods up there?
Well, I wrote a blog post maybe a month ago, 6 weeks ago, on basically saying that I would not be voting for either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. That for me, and again, and I always need to say this because people, this is their response. You know, they say, well, there's no perfect candidate. And my response to that is, I know that. But this is the first election that I have ever voted in where I feel that both the major candidates so fail the character test that I, in good conscience, cannot vote for either one. Now, and I have had that response from my friends who are voting for Donald Trump, and my friends who are voting for Hillary Clinton will say to me, a non-vote for one is a vote for the other. First, I want to say I find that just a little bit disingenuous and manipulative, that I should go ahead and vote for your candidate because you decided the other one is worse, and therefore, if I don't vote for your candidate, I'm somehow culpable if the other candidate wins the election. So, you know, I just I have to say that I think I'm a rather calm person, but that kind of sets me off a little bit. I think the other thing I want to say about Christians and voting, listen, I'm all for democracy. I'm all for voting. I vote, and I will vote on election day in November because there's plenty of other issues and people to vote for or against. And I'm not, so I'm going to be voting. I'm just not going to be voting for president. But I want to say that I think Christians in America have turned voting into a fetish, and that it's almost as if that's the single most important thing we could do. And if I make the decision that for moral reasons, and I know there'll be others who disagree with me on this, but if I make decision for moral reasons that I cannot vote for either candidate, or I can't, or at least do a protest vote, which I think doesn't, make much difference, then somehow I'm abdicating some kind of sacred responsibility. And I see Christians get more excited and more exercised over the issue of whether or not you vote than, frankly, they get more excited over that than they do Jesus. I think that's a concern.
It's been interesting to me because I've heard the same thing. If whoever I don't vote for, if I don't vote for one or the other, a non-vote is a vote for the other. And of course, statistically, those both can't be true. But I would say that my vote doesn't actually belong to any candidate until I give it. And therefore, I'm not denying it from a candidate if I don't. You also brought up another important point I'd like to underline, which is there are a lot of other issues and candidates in the election, all the way from local up through state. And very important things about our lives are determined by these people. And very often, very, very poor candidates are elected because of extremely low turnout and really very low competition, because there's a greater turnout for the presidential election. And that is, in my view, is somewhat self-defeating. If you really want to have an impact on the country, start by voting in your city, town, county elections and actually paying attention to them.
Yeah. Well, sure. And, one can ask the question. I mean, I guess I understand why the presidential election is so important. It seems to take on more importance than other elections. But, the reality is that that's only one branch of government. And you've got Congress. In Ohio, we've got a Senate race in November. And so there are certainly local issues. And in fact, in some ways, you can make the case that those local matters affect you and me and others in a daily way that who's sitting in the White House doesn't.
Well, it's good to talk to you about that. Last week, just for those who are following these politics moments, last week I talked to somebody who would is an advocate for the Republican Party. And this week we're talking, more in my territory, which is not for either party. And I'll say with you, I will definitely be at the, I will be at my polling place on election day. I happen to be an election day voter. I like to vote on the actual day and go to the polling place. That's just traditional. I'll be there and I will be filling out a ballot. But I will not necessarily, I'm not going to say who I'm going to vote for, but I will not necessarily vote for one of the major party candidates. Yeah. And that would be in any particular race if I, depending on the issues I might have with a particular person. So,
yeah, the other thing is that concerns me about Christians and so much importance they place on elections and what's happening is that it becomes an eschatology, becomes what I think becomes a rival eschatology to the eschatology of the Bible.
Yeah, and we view, and we also try to incorporate the electoral politics into our theology. I mean, I get regular emails from quite a number of perspectives. I don't know if you, I'm on a number of these lists just to see what's going on, but, words from the Lord that so-and-so ought to win, and another word from the Lord that this person is a plague on the country that's being sent by God as a judgment, and at a minimum that no more than one of those people can actually be hearing from God.
That's right.
But they get incorporated.
Yeah. Yes, it does. Well, it has been a long tradition of the temptation, and all of us have the temptation at times to make Jesus or make the scripture or make our theology serve our own agendas. And so it becomes, if indeed God has spoken to somebody in this, then obviously it becomes critical and important in a way that it probably in reality is not. But we do have this tendency to manipulate the gospel for our own ends.
Okay, and with that, I think we probably can call it a conclusion on the political discussion for today. Let's not do that.
Okay.
Not manipulate. It sounds like a plan. I do want to mention before I let you go that I'm about to review the electronic proof of Colossians and Philemon, a participatory study guide, which has been long in process, but it should be ready to start ordering this afternoon. So do you want to give anybody a word on this this new book that you've just completed? I think it's a lifetime almost of research on Colossians. Yeah. And we put a 150-page book, and there it is.
Yes. Well, I would say maybe to connect it to our current discussion or where we just ended is that in this political season, Colossians is a reminder to us of who is at the center of history and who actually gives meaning and purpose to history, and that's Jesus Christ. He is in the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, and all things are connected to him. And so it does put in perspective, puts into, I think, a realistic perspective, the earthly agendas that sometimes we Christians get too wrapped up in.
Okay. Well, I don't have a cover on hand. I will say that in our showcase, we have, I have a link to Allan's author page on our Energion Direct retail website. The book is available there. And possibly even more relevant is his earlier book, The Politics of Witness, which again deals with putting Jesus ahead in our priorities of all these other things that we have, including the politics. So with that, I'm going to conclude today's politics moment. Thank you, Allan, for joining us.
Thank you.
And discussing.